I bury my conscience in the high desert 20 years ago, alongside the men I killed to save a town that never thanked me. Now that town is dying, and the ghosts I left behind are clawing their way back through the dust. They say the past stays buried in these dry lands. They're wrong. Some debts demand payment in flesh, and mine just came due with interest sharper than any Bowie knife. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The town of Bitter Springs looked like God had started building it, then changed his mind halfway through and walked away in disgust. What buildings stood were sun-bleached skeletons leaning against each other like drunks after last call, their paint peeled to raw wood that groaned in the wind. The well in the center of town, once the lifeblood of this settlement, had run dry 3 summers past, leaving only a gaping mouth in the earth that swallowed sound and hope in equal measure. Population had dwindled from 200 souls to maybe 40, and those who remained did so out of stubbornness rather than sense. Sheriff Thomas Garrett stood on the warped porch of his office, watching the November wind drag tumbleweeds down the main street like nature's way of sweeping away the trash. At 63, he was ancient by frontier standards, his face a topographical map of every hard decision he'd ever made. Gray stubble peppered his jaw, and his eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, had faded to the color of dirty ice. The silver star pinned to his vest was tarnished black around the edges, much like the man wearing it. His hand shook these days. Not much, just enough to notice when he poured his morning coffee. Enough to make him wonder if he could still draw his Colt with a speed that had once made him a legend in these parts. The arthritis had settled into his knuckles like squatters in an abandoned claim, and some mornings he couldn't make a proper fist until noon. Behind him, the office door creaked open. Deputy Marcus Webb, 40 years younger and still wearing idealism like an ill-fitting coat, stepped out carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. The boy had arrived in Bitter Springs 6 months ago with a fresh badge and dreams of frontier justice, unaware he'd walked into a town already writing its own eulogy. "Sheriff," Marcus said, handing over 1 cup. "Stagecoach is 3 days late." Thomas took the coffee without looking at him. "Stagecoach stopped running regular routes through here 8 months ago, son. Anything comes through now is either lost or running from something worse than empty desert." Marcus leaned against the porch rail, which protested with an ominous crack. "Folks are getting nervous. Mrs. Chen closed the general store again. Says she can't keep selling on credit when nobody's got money to pay eventually." "Mrs. Chen's got more sense than the rest of us combined." Thomas sipped the bitter coffee, grimacing. "This town's been dying for 5 years. We're just the ones too stubborn to lie down." The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of dust and something else, something that made Thomas's spine straighten despite the arthritis. It was the scent of rain, impossible as that seemed. Rain hadn't fallen on Bitter Springs in 16 months, ever since the drought had strangled the last of the cattle ranches and driven the farmers to greener territories. Marcus noticed it too. "You smell that?" "Storm coming," Thomas said quietly. "Bad one, judging by the feel." But it wasn't just weather that had Thomas's instincts screaming. In his decades wearing a badge, he developed a sixth sense for trouble, and right now every nerve ending was firing warnings like telegraph signals. Something was coming to Bitter Springs, riding in on that storm's coattails, and whatever it was had Thomas touching the grip of his revolver like a man checking to make sure his soul was still attached. The first drops began to fall an hour later, fat, heavy drops that struck the dust like bullets, each one creating a tiny crater. Within minutes, the rain intensified to a downpour that hadn't been seen in living memory, turning the main street into a river of mud. The remaining townspeople stood in doorways and windows, watching the deluge with expressions caught between wonder and suspicion. Good things didn't happen to Bitter Springs. Even a blessing like rain felt like the prelude to something worse. Thomas was in the office, wrestling with paperwork that didn't matter anymore. when he heard the horse, not the usual clatter of hooves on hard-packed dirt, but the sucking sound of something moving through deep mud. He stood slowly, joints protesting, and moved to the rain-streaked window. Through the downpour, he could make out a single rider approaching from the east. The figure sat hunched in the saddle, wearing a long duster that had turned black with water. A wide brim had obscured the face, and the horse, a gray that looked like it had been carved from smoke, moved with the plodding determination of an animal that had come a very long way. Marcus appeared at Thomas's shoulder. "Who rides through weather like this?" "Someone who doesn't care if they live or die," Thomas said, "or someone who's got business that won't wait." The rider stopped in front of the sheriff's office, making no move to dismount. Just sat there in the rain, water streaming off the hat brim like a curtain. Thomas could feel those eyes on him, though he couldn't see them. The sensation crawled across his skin like spiders. Finally, the rider spoke. The voice was rough, scraped raw by weather and time, but there was something familiar in it that made Thomas's blood run cold. "Sheriff Thomas Garrett. Been a long time." Thomas's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "State your business." The rider tilted their head, water cascading off the hat. "My business is with you, Thomas, and with Bitter Springs. I've come back to collect what's owed." "I don't know you," Thomas said, but his voice betrayed him, cracking on the last word. The rider laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "Oh, you know me, Sheriff. You knew me 20 years ago when you and your boys left me for dead in the canyon. You knew me when you took credit for cleaning out the Valdez gang while I was bleeding out in the rocks. You knew me when you built your reputation on my grave." Slowly, deliberately, the rider reached up and removed the hat. Rain-soaked hair plastered to a face that Thomas had indeed known once upon a time. A face that should have been dead and buried for 2 decades. Elena Valdez, sister to the gang leader he'd killed. The woman who'd ridden at his side during that final confrontation, who'd taken 3 bullets meant for him, who'd fallen into the canyon while Thomas and his posse rode away claiming total victory. But that was impossible. He'd seen her fall, seen the blood, seen the body disappear into the shadows of that ravine. "You died," Thomas whispered. Elena's smile was a terrible thing, full of teeth and absence of mercy. "I got better. And I've spent every day of the last 20 years thinking about what I'm going to do when I finally found you again." She dismounted with fluid grace despite the mud and the rain, her boots hitting the ground with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Thomas's deputy had his gun half drawn, but Thomas waved him back with a sharp gesture. "This is between me and her," he said. "That's right," Elena agreed, water dripping from her duster, from her hair, from the barrel of the revolver she'd pulled from beneath her coat. "This is personal, Thomas. 20 years personal, and I'm going to enjoy every second of settling this score." The rain continued to pour down on Bitter Springs, washing away 20 years of dust and lies, revealing the bones of old sins that had never properly been buried. And in that moment, Thomas Garrett understood that the drought hadn't been the worst thing to happen to his town. The worst thing had just ridden in out of the storm, wearing the face of a ghost he'd tried to forget, carrying vengeance that had aged like whiskey, stronger, sharper, and far more potent than it had been when first distilled. Elena Valdez hadn't moved from her spot in the mud, but her presence filled the street like smoke fills a closed room, suffocating, inescapable. The rain continued its assault on Bitter Springs, but the sound of it faded into background noise, irrelevant compared to the ringing silence stretching between the woman with the gun and the sheriff who'd betrayed her. Thomas's mind raced backward through time, pulled against his will into memories he'd spent 2 decades trying to drown in whiskey and justify with lies. The Valdez gang. Jesus. How long had it been since he'd let himself think that name without flinching? It had been 1863, height of the lawless years when the war between the states had pulled most federal authority east, leaving the territories to fend for themselves. The Valdez gang, led by Elena's brother Carlos, had been terrorizing the southern territories for 3 years. Bank robberies, stagecoach holdups, and twice they'd burned entire settlements when the locals resisted. Carlos Valdez was a name whispered like a curse, and the bounty on his head had grown to $5,000, dead or alive. Thomas had been young then, 43, and hungry for the kind of reputation that would elevate him above the endless parade of badge-wearing nobodies who lived and died in dusty towns without ever making a mark. When word came that the Valdez gang was holed up in Copper Canyon, 60 miles south of Bitter Springs, he'd assembled a posse of 12 men, deputies, bounty hunters, and a few local ranch hands who fancied themselves brave. And Elena. Christ, he'd almost forgotten about Elena. She'd come to him 3 days before the raid, slipping into his office after midnight like a shadow with a pulse. Thomas had gone for his gun, but she'd raised her hand slowly, showing she was unarmed. When she spoke, her voice had been steady despite the fear he could see flickering in her dark eyes. "I want to help you kill my brother." Thomas had nearly laughed. Nearly, but something in her face stopped him. A hardness that suggested this wasn't an impulse or a trap, but a decision she'd arrived at through blood and pain. She told him everything. How Carlos had changed after their parents died. How the man she'd known as a protective older brother had rotted from the inside out, becoming something monstrous. How she'd stayed with the gang because leaving meant dying, but how she'd been planning her escape for months. She offered Thomas something invaluable: the layout of their canyon hideout, the rotation of sentries, and the exact location where Carlos slept. "Why should I trust you?" Thomas had asked. Elena's answer had been simple: "Because I'm going to ride in with you. If I'm lying, shoot me first." And she had. Elena Valdez had ridden at the front of that posse, guiding them through the labyrinth of canyons, past the sentries, right to the heart of her brother's operation. The raid had been a bloodbath, ugly, close quarters fighting in the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas had killed Carlos himself, putting 3 rounds into the man's chest while Carlos was still reaching for his gun. But then everything had gone wrong. One of the gang members, a scarred bastard named Pike, had recognized Elena, started screaming that she'd betrayed them, that she'd sold them out, and the other gang members, the ones still alive and fighting, had turned on her with the fury of the condemned. Thomas remembered seeing her running, trying to reach her horse, 3 gang members chasing her through the rocks. He'd had a choice in that moment: go after Elena, try to save her, risk his men, and potentially lose everything they'd gained, or let her go, let her take the consequences of her choices, and ride back to town a hero. Thomas had chosen heroism. He'd ordered his men to let her go, to focus on securing the camp and gathering the bodies. They'd heard the gunshots echoing through the canyon, sharp cracks that spoke of executions rather than combat. They'd heard Elena scream once, a sound that cut through the air like broken glass, and then silence. 2 of his men had gone looking afterward, found her hat and her gun at the edge of a ravine. Blood on the rocks. No body. But the fall was 100 feet into darkness. Nobody survived a drop like that, especially not after taking 3 bullets. Thomas had ridden back to Bitter Springs and reported that the Valdez gang had been completely eliminated, including Carlos's sister, who died fighting alongside her brother. He'd been celebrated, promoted. His name had appeared in newspapers as far east as St. Louis. The bounty money had bought him a house and the respect that came with being a legend. And Elena Valdez had been forgotten, erased from history, her betrayal of her brother rewritten as loyalty, her death made noble instead of convenient. Now she stood before him, 20 years older but very much alive, and Thomas understood that time hadn't weakened her anger. It had crystallized it into something pure and terrible. "You remember now," Elena said. It wasn't a question. She could read it in his face, the guilt bleeding through his weathered features. "I can see it in your eyes. The canyon, the bullets, the fall." "Elena," Thomas started, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. Don't say my name like we're old friends catching up. Don't insult both of us with excuses." She stepped closer, her boots sucking in the mud. "I spent 6 months healing from those bullets. Took me a year to climb out of that ravine on a broken leg that said wrong. took me 5 years to rebuild myself into something that could walk back into civilization without being recognized as Carlos Valdez's dead sister. The rain streamed down her face, but Thomas couldn't tell if the wetness on her cheeks was weather or tears. And I spent every single one of those 7,300 days thinking about this moment, Elena continued. About what I would say when I finally found you. About whether I'd kill you quick or make you suffer. About whether I'd burn this whole town down just to watch you lose everything the way I lost everything. Marcus had gone pale beside Thomas, his hand still hovering near his gun. The deputy glanced at Thomas, looking for guidance, but Thomas had none to give. What do you do when your past comes for you wearing a face you'd convinced yourself was safely dead? I didn't know you survived, Thomas said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. Elena's laugh was bitter. You didn't look. That's not the same as not knowing. You didn't send anyone back for my body. Didn't check the ravine. You just rode away and wrote your report and spent the blood money. Tell me, Sheriff, did it buy you everything you hoped? Was betraying the woman who saved your life worth the reputation? Thomas had no answer. His hand had moved away from his gun, hanging useless at his side. What was the point of drawing? She was right. Every word she spoke was a truth he'd been running from for 2 decades. The town doesn't know, Elena said quietly, about what really happened in Copper Canyon, about how their legendary sheriff built his name on the back of a woman he left to die. But they're going to find out. Before I'm done here, everyone in Bitter Springs is going to know exactly what kind of man has been keeping them safe all these years. She holstered her gun with deliberate slowness, and somehow that was more threatening than if she'd kept it aimed at his chest. I'm not going to kill you today, Thomas. That would be mercy, and you don't deserve mercy. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to make you watch as I dismantle everything you built. Your reputation, your town, your peace. And when there's nothing left, when you're standing in the ashes of your legend, then maybe I'll put you out of your misery. Elena turned and walked back to her horse, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. She looked down at Thomas one last time, rain dripping from the brim of her hat. Sleep well, Sheriff. What's left of your life is going to be very, very short. She rode off into the storm, leaving Thomas standing in the mud with his deputy and his guilt, watching a ghost disappear into the rain. And for the first time in 20 years, Sheriff Thomas Garrett felt something he'd forgotten fear. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving Bitter Springs transformed into a mudscape of confusion and whispered rumors. Word of the mysterious rider had spread through the town's remaining population like cholera, mutating with each retelling. Some said it was a bounty hunter come for someone hiding in town. Others claimed it was one of the sheriff's old enemies finally catching up with him. A few of the more superstitious residents swore they'd seen a ghost riding a horse made of storm clouds. Thomas spent that first night in his office, unable to face the empty house that had started feeling more like a mausoleum than a home. He sat in the darkness, not bothering to light the lantern, his mind churning through decades of carefully constructed lies. Marcus had tried to ask questions. Who was the woman? What did she want? Should they be worried? But Thomas had sent the boy away with terse dismissals that bordered on cruelty. He knew what Elena was doing. She wasn't going to simply shoot him and ride off into the sunset. That wasn't revenge. That was a favor. No, she was going to pick apart his life thread by thread, exposing every rot beneath until the legend of Thomas Garrett collapsed under the weight of its own falseness. The question was, how? The answer arrived 3 days later, on a morning so clear and cold it hurt to breathe. Thomas was making his rounds, a mostly symbolic gesture in a town with barely enough people to constitute a crowd, when he noticed the paper. Someone had tacked it to the wall of the church, right next to the notice board where town announcements were posted. From a distance, it looked official, like something from the territorial government. Up close, it was something far worse. It was a wanted poster, but not for any criminal. The face staring back from the yellowed paper was his own, sketched in remarkable detail, though the artist had added 20 years back to his features. Below the image, in precise handwriting, was a text that made his blood run cold. Thomas Garrett, wanted for questioning, regarding the events of June 12, 1863. Copper Canyon Massacre. Information sought concerning the death and disappearance of Elena Valdez, informant. $500 reward for verified testimony. Contact E. Valdez, Bitter Springs Hotel. She was offering money. In a town starving for resources, she was offering $500 to anyone who could provide information about events that had happened before most of the current residents had even arrived. It was brilliant and cruel. She was weaponizing the town's desperation against him. Thomas ripped the poster down, crumpling it in his fist. But even as he did, he saw Mrs. Chun emerging from her store, her weathered face troubled. She'd seen it. So had the Bartlett brothers, who were pretending to work on their wagon across the street, but were really watching Thomas, with new calculation in their eyes. So had Reverend Walsh, who stood in the church doorway with an expression of concern that looked too practiced to be genuine. "Sheriff," Mrs. Chin called out, approaching slowly. "Is there something we should know?" "That poster." "It's nothing," Thomas said tersely. "Someone's idea of a joke." But Mrs. Chin wasn't a fool. She'd run a successful business in 5 different frontier towns before settling in Bitter Springs, and she hadn't done it by ignoring obvious lies. A joke that offers $500? "Sheriff, if there's trouble coming, the people here deserve to know." "There's no trouble," Thomas insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's old business. Settled business." "Then why is someone paying to unsettle it?" Thomas had no answer to that. He walked away, feeling the weight of Mrs. Chen's stare on his back, feeling the town's trust beginning to crack. By noon, 3 more posters had appeared, one on the saloon, one on the blacksmith shop, and one nailed to the door of the sheriff's office itself. Elena was making sure everyone saw, making sure the questions started spreading like contagion. Thomas spent the afternoon tracking her down. It wasn't difficult. She'd taken a room at the town's only hotel, a 2-story structure that had seen better days, but still maintained delusions of grandeur. The hotel owner, a nervous man named Pettigrew, pointed Thomas to room 7 on the 2nd floor, then quickly found urgent business elsewhere. Thomas climbed the stairs slowly, each step an effort. His gun felt heavy at his hip, a weight that pressed down on his conscience as much as his belt. He stopped outside room 7, fist raised to knock, when Elena's voice drifted through the thin door. "Come in, Thomas. It's not locked." He entered to find her sitting by the window, backlit by the afternoon sun in a way that made her face hard to read. She'd changed clothes, trading her trail-worn duster for a simple dark dress that made her look almost respectable. Almost. The gun belt draped over the chair beside her ruined the illusion. "The posters," Thomas said without preamble. "They won't work. Nobody in this town was around in '63. Nobody knows anything." "True," Elena agreed. "But that's not really the point, is it? The point is that now they're asking questions. Now they're looking at their legendary sheriff and wondering what he's hiding. Now they're poor enough that $500 sounds like salvation, and desperate people have creative memories." She stood, moving to a small table where a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses waited. She poured both glasses, sliding one across the table toward Thomas. "People don't need facts to lose faith," Elena continued. "They just need doubt, and I'm going to give them so much doubt they'll drown in it." Thomas ignored the offered whiskey. "What do you want, Elena? You want me to admit what happened? Fine, I admit it. I left you to die. I took credit for your work. I built my reputation on your grave. There, confession given. Now what?" "Now nothing," Elena said, drinking from her glass. "Your confession means nothing without context, without witnesses, without the town understanding the full scope of your betrayal." She smiled, and it was terrible to see. "I'm not here for your guilt, Thomas. I'm here to architect your complete destruction." "Why?" The word burst from Thomas with more desperation than he'd intended. "Why after 20 years? If you survived, if you rebuilt your life, why come back now?" Elena set down her glass with deliberate care. Because I didn't rebuild my life, Thomas. I built something else. I spent 2 decades tracking down everyone who was in that canyon. Your deputies, the bounty hunters, the ranch hands, all 12 men who rode out with us that day. Something cold slithered down Thomas's spine. What did you do? What do you think I did? Elena's voice was soft, almost gentle. I made sure they couldn't back up your story. I made sure that when I finally came for you, you'd be alone. No witnesses to support your version of events. Just a legendary sheriff and a woman who's supposed to be dead, and her word against yours. Thomas felt the room tilt slightly. You killed them. All of them. Not all at once. Took years. Had to be patient. Had to make sure each one looked like an accident or a natural death. But yes, Thomas, I killed every single man who rode into that canyon with us. You're the last one. The prize I've been saving. She walked toward him slowly, each step measured. And now you understand. This isn't about revenge anymore. This is about justice. The kind of justice that takes everything you have and leaves you with exactly what you left me with. Nothing but pain and the memory of who you used to be. Thomas's hand moved toward his gun, but Elena shook her head. You're not going to shoot me. Not here, not now. Because the moment you do, you prove everything I'm accusing you of. You become the corrupt sheriff who murdered the woman trying to expose his crimes. Your legend dies, Thomas. And you'll spend whatever time you have left in a jail cell if the town doesn't lynch you first. She was right. Every word was a trap, and he'd walked into it willingly. Thomas's hand fell away from his gun, useless. I'm going to stay in Bitter Springs for as long as it takes, Elena said, returning to her seat by the window. I'm going to talk to every person in this town. I'm going to plant seeds of doubt in every conversation. I'm going to make them see you the way I see you. As a liar, a coward, and a thief. And when I'm done, when your reputation is ash and your authority is broken, I'm going to ride away and leave you here to rot in the ruins of your legend. Thomas turned and left without another word. There was nothing to say. She had him boxed in, trapped by the very lies he'd spent 20 years maintaining. He descended the stairs on legs that felt like water, emerged into the late afternoon sun, feeling older than he'd ever felt in his life. Across the street, the Bartlett brothers were watching. So was Mrs. Chun. So was Reverend Walsh. All of them looking at him now with questions in their eyes, with doubt beginning to take root. Elena Valdez's revenge had begun, and Thomas Garrett had no idea how to stop it. 5 days after Elena's arrival, the unthinkable happened. Someone called a town meeting. Not the sheriff, as was customary. Not the reverend or the mayor. Bitter Springs technically had won, though the position was largely ceremonial at this point. The meeting was called by Mrs. Chun, posted on official notice boards throughout town, requesting all residents to gather at the church on Saturday evening to discuss matters concerning public safety and leadership. Thomas understood immediately what this meant. Elena's poison had worked faster than he'd anticipated. The remaining residents of Bitter Springs, all 43 of them, were gathering not to support their sheriff, but to question him. Saturday arrived with weather that matched Thomas's mood. Overcast, threatening rain, but never quite delivering it. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the town like a lid on a coffin. Thomas spent the day in his office, alternating between rehearsing explanations that sounded increasingly hollow and staring at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Marcus tried to be supportive. Sir, whatever happened 20 years ago, the people here know you. They know what you've done for this town. That has to count for something. You're young, Thomas said, not unkindly. You still think history matters less than truth. But I'll tell you something that'll serve you better than idealism ever will. People don't care about truth. They care about the story they can believe. And Elena's offering them a better story than mine. One where they're not fools for trusting a liar all these years. At 6 o'clock, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Thomas walked to the church. He considered not attending, but absence would be an admission of guilt. His only chance, slim as it was, lay in facing the accusations directly and hoping his decades of service would outweigh 5 days of Elena's whispered truths. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls, faces turned toward the front where Mrs. Chun stood beside the pulpit. And there, sitting in the front row, was Elena Valdez, dressed respectably, her hands folded in her lap like a woman at prayer. She looked up as Thomas entered, and the ghost of a smile touched her lips. Thomas took his position at the front, facing the congregation. Marcus stood beside him, hand resting on his gun belt in a show of support that Thomas knew was ultimately meaningless. If this crowd turned, one deputy wouldn't make a difference. Mrs. Chin cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is unusual, but circumstances have forced us to address some difficult questions." She turned to Thomas. "Sheriff, I'll speak plainly. A woman arrived in town claiming to have information about your past. She's made serious allegations about events that occurred during your raid on the Valdez gang. Before rumors tear this town apart, we need to hear the truth. From both of you." "She's a liar," Thomas started, but Mrs. Chin raised a hand. "Everyone will have their say, Sheriff. But first, Miss Valdez has provided documentation that we need to address." She held up a sheaf of papers. "These are newspaper clippings from 1863, articles about the Copper Canyon raid. And she's also provided a sworn affidavit from the Territorial Marshal's office, archived records that mention an informant in the case. An informant whose name was redacted but who was female and related to Carlos Valdez." Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath him. He thought all of those records had been lost, destroyed in various office fires and relocations over the years. But Elena had been thorough, spending 2 decades gathering every scrap of evidence that supported her claim. "The records show that an informant was used," Mrs. Chen continued. "The records also show that this informant was supposed to receive witness protection and relocation funds. But according to the final report, signed by you, Sheriff Garrett, no such person existed. The report states that all members of the Valdez gang, including Carlos's sister Elena, were killed in the raid." Murmurs rippled through the church. Thomas could feel the shift in the air. The way doubt crystallized into something harder, more accusatory. Elena stood slowly. "May I speak?" Mrs. Chen nodded. "Please." Elena turned to face the congregation, and Thomas saw a master at work. She prepared for this moment, every word calibrated for maximum impact. "My name is Elena Valdez," she began. 20 years ago, I betrayed my brother to save the lives of innocent people he planned to kill. I provided Sheriff Garrett with information that allowed him to successfully raid our hideout. I guided his men through the canyons. I risked everything because I believed in justice, even when it meant destroying my own family." Her voice cracked slightly, a perfect touch of vulnerability. "After the raid, members of my brother's gang recognized me as a traitor. They chased me through the rocks, shooting at me. I was hit 3 times. I fell into a ravine, and as I lay there, bleeding and broken, I called out for help. I called for the sheriff who'd promised me protection, who'd sworn I'd be taken care of if I helped him." She turned to look at Thomas directly, and he rode away. "He left me to die because a dead informant was more convenient than a living one. Dead, I couldn't contradict his report. Dead, I couldn't claim any of the bounty or the credit. Dead, I couldn't tell anyone that the legendary raid had been made possible by a woman's betrayal of her own blood." The church had gone completely silent. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. "But I didn't die," Elena continued. "I survived, and I spent 20 years rebuilding myself, gathering evidence, tracking down the truth. Not for revenge, though I won't pretend I don't want that, but because the people of Bitter Springs deserve to know that the man they've trusted for 2 decades built his reputation on theft and betrayal." She sat down, a picture of controlled emotion, while the church erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped, angry and confused, everyone trying to speak at once. Thomas saw the faces of people he'd known for years: Mrs. Chun, the Bartlett brothers, Reverend Walsh, families he'd protected and helped, all looking at him now with suspicion and disappointment. Quiet, Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the noise. "Sheriff Garrett, you'll have your chance to respond. What do you say to these accusations?" Thomas looked out at the congregation, at faces that had once held respect and now held doubt. He could lie. God knew he'd gotten good at it over the years. He could construct a counter-narrative, paint Elena as a bitter criminal seeking revenge for her brother's death. Some might believe him, maybe enough to let him keep his badge. But he was so tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of carrying the weight of what he'd done. Tired of being the legend instead of the man. "It's true," he said quietly. The church went silent again, but this was a different kind of silence. Shocked, breathless. "Not all of it," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "But the parts that matter. Elena Valdez did help me raid her brother's gang. She did risk her life. And when things went bad, when she was being hunted by the surviving gang members, I made a choice. I chose my career over her life. I ordered my men not to pursue her attackers. I left her in that canyon and rode home to claim glory I didn't fully earn." He saw Marcus's face go pale beside him, saw Mrs. Chen's expression harden, saw Reverend Walsh close his eyes as if in pain. "I told myself it was necessary," Thomas said. "I told myself that saving her would risk more lives, that the mission came first. But the truth is simpler and uglier than that. I was ambitious. I wanted the reputation. I wanted the reward. And a dead informant was tidier than a living one who might complicate the story." He turned to Elena. "You're right about what I did. You're right that I betrayed you. You're right that I've been living a lie for 20 years. And you're right that I deserve whatever you've planned for me." Then he turned back to the congregation. "But before you judge me, and you should judge me, understand this. For 20 years, I've tried to be the man I pretended to be that night. Every decision I've made as sheriff of this town, I've tried to make with honor. Every life I've protected, every criminal I've brought to justice, every time I've put myself between danger and the innocent, I've done it trying to atone for what I did to her." He removed the badge from his vest, the metal catching the lamplight one last time. "I know that doesn't make it right. I know it doesn't earn forgiveness. But it's the truth, and I'm done hiding from it. Mrs. Chen, I hereby resign as sheriff of Bitter Springs. The town deserves better than a man built on lies." He set the badge on the pulpit and walked toward the exit. The congregation parted before him like water, no one wanting to touch him, no one willing to meet his eyes. Marcus started to follow, but Thomas waved him back. This walk, he needed to make alone. Outside, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall again. Thomas stood on the church steps, feeling the water on his face, and realized that Elena Valdez had won. She'd taken everything, his reputation, his position, his town's trust. She'd done exactly what she'd promised. And somehow, standing there in the rain with nothing left but the truth, Thomas Garrett felt lighter than he had in 20 years. Thomas spent that night in his house, not in the office that was no longer his. He'd expected anger, perhaps even violence from the townspeople. What he got instead was something worse: indifference. People stepped aside when he walked down the street the next morning, their faces carefully neutral. Not hostile, not sympathetic, just empty. He'd become invisible, irrelevant, a ghost haunting a town that had already moved on. Marcus had been appointed temporary sheriff by Mrs. Chun, and the town council, formed the previous night. Apparently, Bitter Springs had suddenly developed a functional government now that Thomas wasn't running things. The young deputy had come by Thomas's house that morning, uncomfortable and earnest. "Sir Thomas, I just want you to know that I don't think less of you. What you did for Elena, leaving her like that, it was wrong. But 20 years of good service, that should count for something." "It doesn't," Thomas said simply. "And it shouldn't. You're a good man, Marcus. Don't make my mistakes. When you're faced with a choice between your career and doing right by someone, choose the person. The career isn't worth what it costs." Marcus had left looking troubled, and Thomas had spent the rest of the day putting his affairs in order. He'd saved money over the years, enough to leave town and start over somewhere nobody knew his name or his history. He'd already begun mentally composing the letter he'd leave for Marcus, detailing which prisoners needed watching, which families might need help. All the little details of running a dying town. Elena came to him on the third night after the church meeting. He heard the knock and knew somehow that it was her, knew that the final act of her revenge was about to play out. He opened the door to find her standing in the darkness, rain falling steadily behind her. "Come to finish it?" Thomas asked. "May I come in?" He stepped aside, and she entered a small house. Humble furniture, a cold fireplace, walls decorated with nothing personal, because he'd never let anyone close enough to make a home. Elena looked around slowly, taking in the emptiness of his life. "This is how you've lived?" she asked. "All these years, all that reputation, and this is all you have to show for it?" "I never felt I deserved more," Thomas admitted. "Comfort felt like betraying you further." Elena moved to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street. "I want to tell you something," she said finally. "Something I haven't told anyone else." Thomas waited, saying nothing. "When I fell into that ravine, when I was lying there with 3 bullets in me and a broken leg, I didn't hate you. Not at first. I understood. In that moment, bleeding out in the dark, I actually understood why you made the choice you did. The mission was more important than one person. The greater good outweighed individual sacrifice. I believed that too once. It's why I betrayed my brother." She turned to face him. "But then I didn't die. And I had to crawl out of that canyon on broken bones, had to hide from people who wanted me dead, had to rebuild myself from nothing while you were collecting rewards and shaking hands and being celebrated. And that's when the hate came. Not from what you did, but from what you gained from doing it." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. "I understand, and I'm ready. Whatever you're going to do, I won't fight it." Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think I came here to kill you? Thomas, if I wanted you dead, you'd have been dead days ago. A knife in the dark, poison in your whiskey, a bullet from a shadow. There are 1,000 ways I could have ended you without anyone knowing." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to tell me something," Elena said. "And I want the truth, not the legend. That night in the canyon, when you heard me scream, when you knew I was dying, was there even a moment where you considered coming back for me?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas could lie, could give her the comfort of thinking he'd at least hesitated. But he'd promised himself he was done with lies, and Elena deserved better than that. "No," he said quietly. "There wasn't. I made the decision the moment I understood what was happening. I chose my future over your life, and I didn't question it. Not then." Something in Elena's face cracked, just slightly. "Thank you for that, at least. For not pretending there was nobility in it." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm leaving Bitter Springs tomorrow. My work here is done. You've lost everything I wanted you to lose. Your reputation, your position, the respect of your town. But I want you to know something, Thomas. I want you to understand what I learned in that canyon." She turned to face him fully. "When I was lying in the dark, bleeding and alone, I made a choice. I could die hating my brother for what he'd become, hating you for leaving me, hating the world for being cruel and unfair. Or I could survive. Just survive. Get through one more breath, one more heartbeat, one more second. And eventually, those seconds added up to minutes, hours, days. I survived by refusing to let what you did define me." Her eyes glittered in the lamplight. "But then I spent 20 years letting it define me anyway. I tracked down your men. I planned this revenge. I let hatred become my purpose. And I thought it would feel satisfying when I finally destroyed you. But standing here, seeing what you've become, this empty house, this lonely existence, this man who's been punishing himself longer than I could ever punish him, I realized something." "What?" Thomas asked. "That I already won. 20 years ago, in that canyon, I survived what you did to me. And that survival made me stronger than you ever were. You've been carrying the weight of your guilt for 2 decades, letting it eat you alive from the inside. You've been imprisoned by what you did far more effectively than anything I could have done to you." She opened the door, rain and wind rushing in. So I'm leaving, Thomas. I'm walking away from you, and from this town, and from 20 years of hatred, because I realize now that revenge isn't what I needed. What I needed was to see that you'd already destroyed yourself, that I didn't have to do it for you. Elena, Thomas called as she stepped into the rain. She paused, looking back. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not because it will change anything, but because it's true. I'm sorry for what I did to you, and I'm sorry I can't undo it. Elena studied him for a long moment. I know you are. That's what makes this all so tragic. You're not a monster, Thomas. You're just a man who made a terrible choice and spent the rest of his life wishing he hadn't. There's no redemption in that, but there's no damnation either. Just a wasted life and a woman who wasted 20 years hating you for wasting it. She disappeared into the rain, leaving Thomas standing in his doorway. He watched her ride away, a shadow dissolving into darkness, and realized that Elena Valdez's final revenge was the cruelest of all. She'd forgiven him, and in doing so, had taken away even the comfort of deserved punishment. 3 weeks after Elena left, the real rain came. Not the brief, violent storms that had marked her arrival and departure, but steady, gentle rain that fell for days, soaking into the parched earth, filling the well, bringing life back to Bitter Springs. The town that had been dying found itself cautiously and possibly alive again. Ranchers talked about bringing cattle back. Farmers discussed planting season. Mrs. Chun reopened the general store with actual inventory. Thomas watched it all from the window of his house. He'd become a fixture there, the disgraced sheriff who'd given up his badge and his reputation, but hadn't yet found the courage to leave town. Marcus stopped by occasionally, keeping him informed about town business out of courtesy rather than necessity. The young deputy was doing well, better than Thomas had, perhaps because Marcus was building his authority on truth rather than legend. On the first day of December, exactly 1 month after Elena's departure, Thomas received a visitor. He'd been sitting on his porch, watching rain run off the roof, when a horse and rider appeared through the gray curtain of weather. For one irrational moment, his heart leaped. Elena had come back. But it wasn't Elena. The rider was a man in his 60s, withered by sun and time, wearing a marshal's badge. He dismounted slowly, joints clearly aching, and approached Thomas with the careful neutrality of someone who knew his presence might not be welcome. Thomas Garrett. Former Sheriff Garrett, Thomas corrected. I don't use the title anymore. Who's asking? The man reached into his coat, producing a folded document. Marshal James Clayton, Territorial Office. I've been asked to deliver this to you. Thomas took the paper, unfolding it with hands that had started shaking again lately. It was a letter, written in Elena's precise handwriting. Thomas, if you're reading this, it means Marshal Clayton found you. I asked him to wait a month before delivering this letter because I needed time to think about whether I truly meant what I'm going to say. I do. The night I left Bitter Springs, I told you that you'd already destroyed yourself, that my revenge was unnecessary. I meant that, but I've realized something else in the weeks since. We both wasted 20 years on what happened in that canyon. You wasted them on guilt, and I wasted them on hatred. Neither of us can get those years back, but we can choose what we do with what's left. I'm writing to tell you that I've submitted an affidavit to the Territorial Marshal's office, a sworn statement explaining exactly what happened in 1863, including my role in the raid and your decision to leave me behind. But I've also included context that the town of Bitter Springs didn't hear, that you had 12 men to think about, that the gang members pursuing me were armed and dangerous, that the tactical decision you made, while morally wrong, wasn't entirely indefensible from a military standpoint. I'm not exonerating you. What you did was still betrayal, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I'm providing a complete record, not just the parts that serve my revenge. History should be complicated, not convenient. The Marshal's office is reviewing the case. They may choose to take no action, given the decades that have passed. They may choose to formally reprimand you, strip your pension, or pursue charges. I don't know, and I've realized I don't care anymore. The legal system can do whatever it wants with you. I'm done. I'm writing primarily to tell you something I should have said when I had the chance. I survived. Not just the canyon, not just the bullets, but the hatred. I survived it all, and I've decided to keep surviving by letting go of you, the canyon, and everything that came after. I don't forgive you. I don't think I can, not completely. But I release you. From my anger, my plans, my need for revenge. You're free to do whatever you want with what's left of your life, and I'm free to do the same with mine. I hope you find something worth living for beyond guilt. I hope you discover that redemption isn't about erasing what you did, but about choosing to be better with the time you have left. And I hope someday you can look at yourself without flinching. Elena. Thomas read the letter 3 times, then looked up at Marshal Clayton. What happens now? Clayton shrugged. Honestly, probably nothing. The territorial office has bigger problems than the 20-year-old case of questionable leadership. My recommendation is going to be that you cooperate fully with any investigation, that you don't try to leave the territory, and that you live quietly. Can you do that? I've been doing that for the past month, Thomas said. Then we're done here. Clayton climbed back onto his horse, groaning slightly. One more thing. Miss Valdez said to tell you that she's opening a school up in Colorado Territory for children whose parents can't afford proper education. Said she's going to call it the Canyon School. Thought you might want to know. He rode off, leaving Thomas alone with Elena's letter and the steady drum of rain. Thomas sat there for a long time, reading the letter again and again, each time finding new layers of meaning in her words. She'd survived. More than that, she'd chosen to move forward instead of looking back. And in doing so, she'd given him permission to do the same. Not through forgiveness, but through release. Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting less than they had in months. The rain was cleaning the world, washing away dust and ash and the residue of old sins. It couldn't erase what had been done, but it could make room for what came next. He walked inside, pulled out paper and pen, and began to write. A letter to Elena, care of the Canyon School in Colorado Territory. A letter that didn't ask for forgiveness or offer excuses, but simply said thank you for surviving, for telling the truth, for teaching him that redemption wasn't about deserving it, but about choosing to become someone worth redeeming. As he wrote, Thomas realized something. The drought hadn't just broken for Bitter Springs. It had broken for him too. 20 years of living in a desert of his own making. 20 years of refusing to let anything grow because he didn't deserve growth or comfort or peace. But Elena had shown him that survival was its own form of justice. That moving forward didn't mean forgetting what came before, but refusing to be defined by it. When he finished the letter, Thomas put on his coat and walked out into the rain. He had no destination in mind, just a need to move, to be part of the town again instead of hiding from it. As he walked down the muddy street, a few people nodded to him. Not with the respect of before, not with condemnation either, just acknowledgement. He existed. He was part of Bitter Springs. No longer the legend, but just a man. And for the first time in 20 years, that felt like enough. The rain continued to fall, steady and cleansing, and somewhere in Colorado Territory, a woman who'd spent 2 decades in darkness opened the doors of a school built on survival rather than revenge. Neither of them was redeemed, not really, but both of them were free. And in the harsh mathematics of the Wild West, where justice was rare and mercy rarer still, that was as close to a happy ending as either of them would ever get. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.